It's a real pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Claire, for inviting me. Can everybody hear me in the back? We're good to go? Okay, great. And thanks for battling the snow. What a beautiful morning. I mean, it's not great for driving, but didn't it look nice in the trees and everything? My children are like, I want to go play in the snow, which is very unusual for them because they like everything nice and warm. So today's talk, I thought I would do a general overview of the best evidence related to postpartum depression. So I thought I would just, briefly describe what it is, talk about some prevalence rates, talk about what are some of the risk factors, what causes it, the general etiology components. I thought that we would talk about the best way to identify it in your practices in the community. What are the most effective preventative strategies? What's the latest in relation to treatment and how can we be innovative in how we deliver treatment? And I think that we could end with some questions, about 10 minutes for questions. Does that sound reasonable for everyone? Okay, sounds great. And, if you want and you have a real burning question, please feel free to raise your hand. We just can't take lots of questions during the presentation, otherwise it'll just sabotage for time, and I'll be racing at the end. But if you have a real burning question, I have no problem stopping and answering your question in the moment. Okay, sounds good? Okay, let me figure out how we change the slides here. There we go. So let me first start talking about the clinical importance of depression. Depression is common, it's universal, and it's a debilitating public health problem. The World Health Organization has defined depression as one of the leading causes of disability worldwide. For some individuals, this depression will resolve within a few weeks or a few months, but between 30 to 50% of individuals, the depression will only subside a little bit, so they'll have subclinical symptomatology, or they'll have a chronic and reoccurring depressive episode. So we often are now classifying depression as a chronic condition for a lot of individuals. Postpartum depression is just another depressive episode that occurs within the first year postpartum. I know DSM says that it's a depressive episode that starts within the first 4 weeks, but clinically and research-wise, we often define it within the first year postpartum. It makes sense to do that broader window. Otherwise, we're going to miss a significant number of mothers. Approximately 13% of mothers will experience this condition within the first 12 weeks. This 13% is based on a meta-analysis of over 59 different studies that have been conducted around the world. There have been updated meta-analyses around prevalence rates that have increased it up to 19%, but that's looking at minor symptomatology as well. But we know that greater than 1 in 8 mothers will experience this condition within the postpartum period. And if a mother is from a socially disadvantaged group, the prevalence rate is greater. For mothers with a history of depression, that prevalence rate will increase up to 25%. And for mothers who have a history of postpartum depression, the prevalence rate will increase up to 50% among those high-risk moms. It is the most frequent form of maternal morbidity following the birth of a child. We often focus on postpartum infection, hemorrhages, but this is the most common form of maternal morbidity. A lot of women will experience this, and often the symptoms will start within the first 4 weeks postpartum. If you talk to mothers and you look at the qualitative research, they said, I started to feel this early in the postpartum period. Not very often do mothers develop it out of the blue at 6 months postpartum. It often starts early for the majority of mothers, but we also want to continue to be aware of these mothers throughout the first year, because it can, for some mothers, develop a little bit later. But for the majority of mothers, it's within the first 12 weeks, often starting within the first 4 weeks. The causes of postpartum depression, the dramatic hormonal changes during and after pregnancy have resulted in a significant focus of research looking around the biological and hormonal causes of postpartum depression. But there is a growing agreement that postpartum depression really is no different than a depressive episode at another time in one's life. But we do know that there's a peak increase during those first early postpartum months. There's two main perspectives as to why do women or people in general develop depression in general and postpartum depression in particular. There's the biological perspective and there's the environmental and personal perspective. And the biological perspective, I'm not going to go into this into great detail because there's not a lot of interventions that we can implement on the clinical front related to this. And also, I want to keep this talk within an hour and a half, and this would be a very detailed explanation. But let's focus on the environmental and personal perspective because most of the prevention and treatment studies have focused on this type of etiology. For the environmental factors, we have acute life events, chronic stress, and exposure to early adversity. I will explain all these in detail. For the personal factors, we have the cognitive vulnerabilities and we have the interpersonal vulnerabilities. So let's talk about acute life events. We really know that there are some significant events in individuals' lives that can trigger a depressive episode. And the more significant these life events are, you can see the linear relationship in the probability of developing a depressive episode. So a death of a significant family member, including, and then on top of that, you lose your job or something of the sort. You can see that the more of these stressful life events that you have, it can increase the relationship of developing depression. But we also see chronic stress. So this isn't one particular episode that might trigger a depressive episode, but it's life in general and how you're living in the social environment that you're living in that might trigger this depression, most long-term or short-term episodes. And so what we see is a bidirectional effect with this chronic stressor. So if someone is low income, underemployed, for example, so low income, underemployed, potentially young in age, or single marital status, you'll see that there's a chronic cycle where it's hard to get out of that life path, and then you become depressed. And when you're depressed, it's hard for you to change your life circumstances so that you can change your life pathway. And so you can see this chronic cycle developing. And that's why we really pay a lot of attention to these chronic stressors in individuals' lives. These acute life events, these are something that is transitional, but these chronic life stressors often lead to a chronic depressive episodes that are reoccurring. And then we have exposure to early adversity. There's ample evidence of a significant association between childhood emotional, sexual, or physical abuse and adult depression, particularly in women. The mother with a history of trauma or abuse is at significant risk of developing postpartum depression. And there was a very good population-based study that was conducted in the States, and we keep referring to it because it's never been replicated really again. There's the ACEs studies. Have you heard of the ACEs studies down in the States talking about the childhood adversity experiences? Well, there's a really great study that's been conducted in the States, very population-based, that builds upon this preliminary work. So this is the foundational work where we saw really good associations between what happens to a child in their early years and how they are doing as adults, mentally and physically. And we've shown that these childhood adversities are predictive of later developing depression. So parental mental illness. So if the child is exposed to a parent who has a significant mental illness, this is a factor that places the child at risk of them themselves developing depression as adults. Family violence, parental marital problems, the death of a mother or father, the lack of a close relationship with an adult, very important, and parental drinking. So these are significant childhood adversities that place this child at risk of developing depression as an adult. And then they took the modeling further and they said, well, of these variables, which one is predictive of the recurring depression, so that chronic depression? And 3 variables, of all those variables, only 3 came out as significant: parental mental illness, family violence, and parental divorce. So these variables are very much associated with a chronic depressive episodes that occur over and over and over again. And then we have personal vulnerabilities. By that, we're talking about one's cognitive style. So there's individuals out there who either see the world where the glass is half full or half empty. So the individuals that see the world as the glass is half empty, so they have these negative cognitions. They see something and they perceive it very negatively. So these are individuals that are at higher risk of developing depression, because depression is really often about how one perceives and copes and deals with a particular situation. And if they perceive a situation very negatively, they'll think about it over and over and over in their mind, and they have these extreme thoughts around it. And this places a person at risk of developing depression. And then we have interpersonal vulnerabilities. Depression is known to be associated with significant impairment in personal functioning, such as marital conflict, intimate partner violence, and low levels of social support. So people who are isolated, who are lonely, this places them at risk of developing depression. If they're living with someone who you would like to think that is their confidant, but is not, so we have high marital conflict, their partner is not their support individual, it places them at risk of depression. And so when we look at these different causes of postpartum depression, so we look at the stressful life events, the chronic stressors, we look at exposure to childhood adversities, when we look at these interpersonal conflicts and such, we see these come out in the risk factors for postpartum depression. These are the different risk factors that have come out based on a meta-analysis of over 85 studies that have been conducted around the world. Cheryl Beck conducted the study. It's a little bit older, but these risk factors still hold, and they constantly come out when we look at these different models. And the top 3 risk factors are past psychiatric history. So a mother who has had depression independent of childbirth, that mother is at risk of developing depression. If a mother is depressed during her pregnancy and remains untreated, it will often continue into the postpartum period. In fact, some research suggests that postpartum depression is actually, 40% of it is actually depression that occurs antenatally during the pregnancy and continues into the postpartum period. And if a mother is very anxious during her pregnancy, this also places her at risk for postpartum depression. And then the other factors that we look at are more of the psychosocial types of risk factors. So childcare stress. So these mothers are highly anxious in caring for their children. They're feeling overwhelmed. They think that they're not a good mother.